Hiya everyone, I hope you're all doing really good today. It's very hot here right now and we don't have fans. Like, the UK doesn't have fans or aircon or anything like that, so I look like a cave woman. I've already been out and done 2 gigs today and my hair's been in braids, under wigs. This makeup was put on at about 12. It's a whole thing. So please excuse, but hopefully this case will have a lot of pictures so you don't have to look at my face that much. Also, another disclaimer, I am not naked. If you can't see like past like here, I'm wearing clothes. I heard about this case a few years ago and it really upset me, to be honest. Like, every case upsets me to a certain degree, obviously. There's just something about this case that really stuck with me and I've wanted to cover it for a while. Again, didn't want to do it because it had been covered once before, and then everyone on Instagram said that they wouldn't mind doing cases that aren't too well known but have been covered once or twice. So that's what I'm doing again with this one today. If you haven't already, make sure you follow me on Twitter and Instagram, just because that's where I'll usually say if a case is running late or there won't be one that week, which I haven't had to do recently. I also like to ask questions on there, like what case should I do next, would you mind if I did this, etc. So yeah, get involved. Anyway, let's get into the case. So this story is about a girl called Skylar Neese. Her mum and dad were Mary and Dave Neese and she was born on February the 10th in 1996. She was her mum and dad's only child, so obviously they absolutely adored her. There's tons of videos of her being little, just doing fun things. They've got really nice stories about her. She was absolutely cherished, and you can tell. She was described as intelligent, stubborn, compassionate and bubbly. She grew up in West Virginia and the town they lived in was meant to be really quiet, really peaceful and just a nice place to live. When the majority of the story takes place, Skylar was 16 years old and she lived in an apartment with her mum and dad. Her dad worked at Walmart and her mum worked at a medical office. Like most teenagers, Skylar was mostly found hanging out with her friends. She had 2 very close friends, one called Sheila and one called Rachel. She'd known Sheila since she was 8 years old and they met and they became absolutely inseparable. But Rachel was a newer addition who they met in high school. Skylar had a job in Wendy's and she finished there at around 10 PM, came home, gave her mum and dad a kiss goodnight and went to bed. Nothing out of the ordinary at all, just a normal night. The next morning, on July the 6th, her mum and dad got up and they both went to work. Skylar's dad, Dave, came home at midday to give her the car so that she'd be able to go to her next shift at Wendy's. But when he went into the house, he noticed that Skylar's bedroom door was still shut and he thought that she was still asleep in the afternoon, so he started knocking on it. There was no answer, and then eventually he got really worried and just, broke into the room. Skylar's bed hadn't been slept in, her window screen was missing and her window was open as well. Skylar's dad was obviously really worried by this and he called Skylar's mum straight away. When he went to look outside, he noticed that there was a small bench that had been pulled up to Skylar's room, which showed that Skylar had actually left the house, like snuck out in the night. Obviously her dad wants to find out where she is and rings Sheila, her best friend, immediately because she would be the most likely person who would know where Skylar was. Sheila said, yeah, I was speaking to Skylar the night before, but it was around midnight and I haven't seen her. Skylar's mum came home shortly after this and it was becoming clear that no one had seen her, no one knew where she was, so they did the right thing and called the police. Shortly after they spoke to the police, the phone rang and it was Sheila. Sheila said, I have to tell you the truth about what happened last night. She said that her and Rachel had taken Skylar joyriding around Morgantown earlier that night at around 11, but they said that they dropped her back around midnight and that was the last time that they saw her. They admitted to getting high while they were out driving, and they also said that they dropped Skylar a little bit down the road, not directly at her house, because Skylar had said she didn't want to wake up her parents, because obviously she'd get in trouble for sneaking out that late. Sheila and her mum Tara came round shortly after this conversation and they really wanted to help find Skylar. So Skylar's mum and dad, Sheila, Sheila's mum and a few police officers started knocking door to door just to ask if anyone had seen Skylar or knew anything about where she could be. They had absolutely no luck with asking people, but then Skylar's mum Mary remembered that they actually had security cameras on the side of their apartment, so that was the best place to look. They asked the landlord about these cameras and he let them into a little room where he was going to look through them with them. So Skylar's mum and dad, Sheila and her mum were all in that room watching these videos. When he went back to the footage from the night before, it was shown that Skylar went and got willingly into a car at 12:31 a.m. So this would have been about half an hour after her friends had dropped her off. So she stayed there for half an hour and then went and got in a car, and no one knew who was in this car. Obviously her mum and dad were absolutely devastated that she'd done this and that she could possibly be in danger, but they were happy that she had willingly got in. It wasn't like she'd been grabbed and dragged towards the car, which obviously would have been really distressing to watch. She just walks really normally and gets in the car. So the car was seen to have parked on Fairfield Street, which was a street right next to the apartment. And even though all the footage was grainy, the landlord said that the car looked like an SUV. And because on the video Skylar was just walking completely normally towards this car, the officers said, you know, it looks like she's probably ran away and she's gone voluntarily, so give it a few days, hopefully she'll be back and she's just going through a few things. They thought she'd be back in a few days, but unfortunately she wasn't back. Also because of this, they didn't put an Amber Alert out for Skylar, which is what usually happens when a child goes missing. Everyone gets an alert and you're told kind of what vehicle is involved, what the kids look like, and it's really useful to be able to know that straight away in case you can stop someone being abducted. Some people at this point as well thought that maybe someone had followed the girls to Skylar's house when they were all out, so that was a big worry as well. Skylar's mum and dad went on TV to ask Skylar to come home. It's so heartbreaking to watch. Her dad's saying, you know, you won't be in trouble, we just really want you back. If you need to talk, we can talk. And it's horrible to watch that. It's horrible to watch. I can't imagine how they felt at this time. After these TV appeals, people knew that Skylar was missing and would be keeping an eye out for her. So they had lots and lots of sightings and calls that came through saying, oh, I'm sure I saw her in this shop or at this park. And her dad would get straight in the car, go to wherever and just start shouting her. He was desperate to find her. I'm sure the mum was as well, but the dad is on most of the interviews, like being the more vocal out of the two. Some of Skylar's friends from school were trying to contact her on Facebook, just saying, please come home, we want to know you're safe. Just leaving her messages, letting her know that she was loved and the people really wanted her back. Sheila was constantly tweeting saying that she wanted Skylar back and how much she missed her. Like, they'd been best friends since Skylar was 8, so she was devastated. Sheila went to Skylar's house, spoke to her mum and dad and said, can I please go into Skylar's room? And she just sat there and cried, and Skylar's mum went and sat with her and rubbed her back just as she cried, just trying to comfort her. Even though Skylar's disappearance was being treated as a runaway case, there was no activity on her bank card or on her phone, and Skylar hadn't even taken her contact lens solution or her phone charger, which you just wouldn't not take if you weren't planning on coming back very soon. So this was really scary to her parents because it seemed as though all the signs pointed towards Skylar thinking that she would have been back that night. There was still absolutely no news on Skylar's whereabouts, but around the same time as her disappearance there'd been a series of bank robberies. One of the banks had been robbed a month before Skylar's disappearance and one had been robbed 10 days after, so they thought maybe it had something to do with the disappearance. They also found out that the younger brother of one of the suspects of the bank robberies had been a boyfriend of Sheila's and also had known Skylar too, so he was a person of interest and his name was Dylan Conway. And the money from the robbed banks had allegedly been used to buy drugs for teen parties. It was thought that Skylar might have got into the car with someone taking her to this party, overdosed at the party and passed away, and then everyone at the party panicked and her body had been disposed of. But eventually this theory was dropped. Around the same time as these theories, the police thought that maybe there was some kind of party that happened and maybe her friends knew more than they were letting on. On July the 9th, they interviewed Sheila and just said, you know, tell us again what happened. She said again that they picked her up at about 11 and then dropped her off at a road nearby her house about an hour later. The investigators asked Sheila why they dropped Skylar off so far away from her house, but Sheila just said she wanted us to. She didn't want to get in trouble with her mum and dad, so we just did as she asked. The next day, the investigators tried to get in touch with Rachel, but she'd left for church camp. But on July the 6th, so the day it was found that Skylar was missing, she'd been out on a boat with family, just having a good time, not really concerned that her friend had gone missing. Rachel's family, while they were on the boat, had also noticed a big cut behind Rachel's ankle. When Rachel had come back, they finally got a chance to interview her face to face, not just speaking to her on the phone, and she told the exact same story as Sheila. but the detectives noticed that their stories were too similar, as though they'd been rehearsed. So as I said earlier, Skylar and Sheila had been best friends since they were about 8 years old, but at high school they met Rachel and 2 became 3. Rachel was also really religious and she'd take part in a lot of Christian activities, so when the 3 of them started hanging out together, they'd all be drinking, smoking, and the parents of both Skylar and Rachel said that Sheila was the bad influence between the 3 of them. And Skylar's cousin even described Sheila as a bad seed, and a lot of Skylar's other friends just refused point blank to hang out with her if Sheila was going to be around. And a lot of Rachel's friends felt the same, that she was controlling, and that when Rachel had been around Sheila, Rachel's personality was different, she was not very nice anymore. So she wasn't the most liked person by the sound of it. Everything was completely fine for quite a while until Rachel and Sheila were the ones that were getting kind of close and Skylar became more of a third wheel. Rachel and Sheila were dressing like each other, acting like each other, and they started kind of leaving Skylar out, which obviously Skylar really didn't like. In the summer of 2011, it said that Rachel and Sheila had a sexual encounter with Skylar being in the room, and obviously that made her extremely uncomfortable. So Skylar and Sheila ended up having a big row after this, and Skylar just carried on feeling like the third wheel. Friends of Skylar said that she seemed to feel really left out by all of this, and obviously with them taking the relationship to the next level, you can't feel more like a third wheel than that happening. It must be sad with having a friend for that long for her to be kind of taken like that. I imagine Skylar felt really upset. But Skylar still knew all of their secrets, and she'd hint about it in the tweets that she posted too. On September the 6th in 2011, she said, "I'd tell the whole school all the I have on everyone, which is a lot. Hashtag if I could get away with it." In June of 2012, they went on a trip to Myrtle Beach, and Skylar and Sheila just spent the whole time arguing. And when they got home from this trip, Sheila turned to Rachel and said that Skylar had to die. The police had their suspicions after their stories were too similar, but they weren't exactly prepared. The police already knew that there were drugs involved that night and that the girls were all out together. There was a possibility that Skylar had overdosed and she'd been left somewhere. When the police started looking into Skylar's friends, Skylar's mum and dad were just like, back off, like they're going through enough. We know how painful it is, they're going through it. But the police could tell that the girls weren't telling them everything. The police went through tons of CCTV footage to see if they could follow the car on the journey that the girls took that night. And they'd found Sheila's car on CCTV, but it wasn't in an area that they ever said that they were in. Also, the girls' phones were registered in certain areas as pinging off, the phone network towers, so it showed that they weren't in that area that night, they were in a different area. The girls were questioned on this, like why they weren't in the area they said they were in, and they just said that they both forgot to mention it, which obviously was massively suspicious. You don't just forget a whole chunk of a trip. Sheila had said when she was being questioned about this that Skylar didn't go to this part of the trip, but Rachel had said that she was at this part of the trip. Rachel had said that Skylar did go with them, but she'd ran into the woods and they couldn't find her. Both of the girls agreed to take polygraphs at this point. Sheila failed miserably, as one of the detectives said, and Rachel was on her way to the polygraph, got absolutely terrified and jumped out of her dad's car. So she jumped out of a moving vehicle to try and get away from this situation. It was getting round everyone who'd known Skylar that these girls were keeping information, and it was becoming extremely obvious that there was something that wasn't being put forward to the police. Everyone at this point was just like, why are you not coming forward if you've got information? And the police had even granted them immunity, saying that, if you're keeping secrets for Skylar and you tell us where she is, then nothing's going to happen to you. You're not in trouble for keeping that a secret for this long, as long as you tell us now where she is. Eventually it went from pressuring the girls to actual harassment, and even though Sheila didn't seem fazed by this, Rachel started to crack. Rachel had a confrontation with her mum that started in the driveway of a house and then went into the house. Rachel had come to blows with her mum at some point, then locked herself in a room screaming, "You're ruining my life," everything, just completely out of control, which caused her mum to ring the police. Rachel was threatening to kill herself, and when the police came, Rachel was taken to Chestnut Ridge, which is a psychiatric hospital in Morgantown. Rachel was only there for 5 days, but as soon as she got out, her parents drove her down to her attorney's office. It was for another interview, and they hoped that because of this big breakdown that Rachel had had, that they might get some truth out of her. but it wasn't anything that any of them were expecting. They expected to hear Rachel say something like she overdosed and passed away and we panicked. But instead Rachel said we stabbed her, and the only reason she could come up with was we just didn't like her anymore. So before any of this happened, back in October 2011, so the year before, Rachel and Sheila were overheard in a lesson discussing how to dispose of a body. But this was in a forensic science class in biology, and it didn't really seem that out of the blue. There were people in the class there too, and they said that this conversation was specifically about getting rid of Skylar. And people told Skylar about it, but she ignored it and said, oh, it's just a game they've been playing. They kept having conversations like this about Skylar, and Skylar knew that this was happening but just thought it was all a joke. And I think it probably started off as a joke, but then it got very, very serious. And it seemed the more Rachel and Sheila got close, the more they wanted to push Skylar out and isolate her and eventually get rid of her for good. So Rachel was going to go to the Catholic Church camp in July, so they decided that they needed to do it before she went away. In the boot of Sheila's car, they'd put a shovel, bleach, towels and a fresh set of clothes each. Sheila had taken the knives from her kitchen as well and packed those. So on the night that Skylar went missing, as I said earlier, she came in from a shift in Wendy's, went and kissed her mum and dad and went to bed. Around midnight that night, Sheila and Rachel messaged or rang Skylar and asked her to go out for a joyride with them, and Skylar said yeah. Skylar had snuck out with them a couple of times before, and she'd put a bench at the bottom of her window and climbed out that way, and she'd walked calmly towards the car and got in. And that was the car that was seen on the footage, except no one had thought that it was Sheila's car because no one thought to question her story. Sheila was in the room when they all first watched that footage, so she must have been absolutely amazed when no one realised that it was her car. She'd got away with it so early on. And because she'd seen the video, she was able to say that she parked in a different space where there was a blind spot between two cameras, because she wouldn't contradict herself by telling them that. She already knew what they did. It was all really, really clever. They'd all started driving towards a route that Sheila and Rachel had planned to take, but there was a police car halfway along the route that put them off and caused them to take a different route. They went down a road the three of them knew quite well. It said that Sheila's family owned that land or the roads around it, or farmland. I'm not exactly sure what they owned, but that place was connected to Sheila in some way and they were all familiar with it, so it wasn't strange for them to be there. So they parked up and the girls all got out of the car and they were just stood chatting for a while. Skylar started to head towards the car to get a lighter because they were all going to smoke weed. And when her back was turned and she started walking towards the car, Rachel and Sheila counted to 3. And on 3, they jumped and started to stab her. They'd been hiding knives behind their hoodies this whole time and they'd attacked Skylar. Skylar had tried to run away, but she was tackled to the floor by Rachel, who just carried on stabbing her. At one point, Skylar took the knife and was able to fight back, which left a cut above Rachel's ankle, which her family had spotted on the boat trip. But eventually she was overpowered by both of them, just attacking her repeatedly. They stood over her and watched Skylar die, and she was just asking them why until she died. And Sheila and Rachel tried to cut her throat because they'd heard that if you cut the jugular, you will die quicker. So once Skylar was dead, they planned to bury her, but the ground was way too rocky for them and they couldn't get the shovel in it. So they just left her where she was and covered her with branches. Sheila and Rachel washed themselves down in a nearby creek and then disposed of the knives and the clothes. Some people think that Rachel might have disposed of the knives when she was on the boat trip with the family, but that hasn't been confirmed. They left Skylar's mobile phone turned off next to her body and just got in the car and went home. By 9 the next morning, Sheila had retweeted a tweet that said, "Always keep your cool." Rachel confessed all of this to police, but she wasn't arrested after her confession. I don't think detectives fully trusted what Rachel had to say, with her just being out of a mental institution. Rachel was under constant watch by the detectives, but Sheila said absolutely nothing through all of this time. Rachel led detectives to where Skylar's body had been left, and it was only about 7 steps away from the road. But they couldn't find the exact space because it was really, really snowy at the time, so they had to go back 2 weeks later when the snow had cleared up to actually find her. Even with all this happening, they only had Rachel's word to go off, so no arrests were made. Finally, Skylar's body was found 6 months after she'd been left there. At this point, they really needed Sheila to confess like Rachel had, because they had nothing on Sheila at the minute. She just wasn't giving anything up. They even sent Rachel to meet with Sheila wearing a wire, but Sheila didn't say anything that could incriminate her. Eventually, investigators had a warrant to be able to search Sheila's house, get all the knives and take them for investigation, and also to seize Sheila's car. They just needed something to link Sheila to this murder, and they found it. In Sheila's car were traces of Skylar's blood. Sheila was at a restaurant having breakfast with her mum when she was arrested. She wasn't able to explain the situation away anymore. Skylar's blood had been found in a car, and the remains of Skylar's vertebrae showed signs that she had been stabbed. So she'd literally been stabbed in the back by her friends. It's just horrible. On March the 13th, Skylar's death was made public, but without any details about what had happened to her. On that day, Sheila tweeted, "Rest easy, Skylar, you'll always be my best friend." And Rachel posted a few tweets too. One that said, "Rest in peace, baby. I love you and miss you more than anything. May you finally have justice." I've got no idea why they were doing this. No idea. On May the 1st, Rachel had her first day in court and she pled guilty to the murder of Skylar Neese. Her trial's online and she's really emotional through the whole thing. She addresses Skylar's mum and dad and apologises, and her dad basically tells her to shove it, which, good on him. She also agreed to testify against Sheila in any trial. Rachel pled guilty to the murder all the way through her trial, but Sheila, on the other hand, pled not guilty at first. Then Sheila's defence team actually said, "We don't have anything to put as a defence for this girl," so she pled guilty to the murder. Even though Rachel was so apologetic, Sheila never once apologised for what she did, and Skylar's mum says that she commends her for doing this. She said, "I would rather you not lie to me and pretend you're sorry, because this was not an accident." Sheila was found guilty of 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. She was given life in prison and is eligible for parole in 15 years. Rachel was given 40 years in prison and is eligible for parole in 10 years. As I said near the beginning, Skylar had been seen getting into a vehicle voluntarily, so an Amber Alert wasn't sent out for Skylar's disappearance. So now there's something called Skylar's Law, which means that even if it looks like a child was voluntarily going somewhere, you still have to put an Amber Alert out for them to notify everyone that they're missing. And that child's only allowed to be considered a runaway if it's proven that they are. Skylar's got a memorial in the place where she died, where people can go and pay their respects, and a lot of friends and family like to go and leave flowers and souvenirs and notes there. So that was the case. When I first heard about it, I definitely wasn't expecting it to turn out the way it did. I thought as well that maybe there'd been an accident and that the friends were trying to cover it up. I thought maybe she'd met someone on the internet or something like that and got into a car with them. I didn't expect it to be the people she considered her best friends. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. So let me know what you thought about this case, leave me a comment below. Please like and subscribe because it really helps my channel get recommended to other people. As some of you might know, I'm trying to get monetized. I'm not monetized yet. It's a pain in the backside. So even by you just liking it, just anything, it really helps me out. As I said earlier, please follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I upload a new true crime video every single Sunday, so if you subscribe to me, you can expect that, and be sure to turn on the notification bell so you know when it's up. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one.